Okay, so here are my usual announcements for people who are tuning into GoToMeeting. Please be sure that everything is muted, both the sound and the video on your laptop, and use the chat box to communicate and ask questions. But please make sure that you're sending the message only to the organizer. And now I have the pleasure of introducing our brown bag speaker for today, Nicole Mirra. She is an assistant professor of urban teacher education here at Rutgers, and her teaching and research focus on the intersections between critical literacy and civic engagement across multiple contexts, including urban secondary English classrooms, grassroots youth organizations, and digital learning communities. And her topic for today is reimagining civic education, moving from participation and engagement to interrogation and innovation. So here is Nicole.
Hi, webinar folks. I'm going to probably be moving around, so I'm here. So, okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. It's a little chilly. It's getting warmer in here, I feel. I'm going to be moving around a little bit, so one of the exciting parts of this talk will be to see if I trip over this thing in the next hour, so that's something you can look out for. It's a little less than a year ago that I was here standing up in front of this room interviewing for a position here at Rutgers, so I'm really excited to now be here as a colleague. It's been a great first semester, and I'm excited to tell you a little bit about some research that I've been working on. This talk today is going to be based on an article that was published earlier this year in the Review of Research and Education. It was a synthesis of research, and it puts forward a conceptual argument. So a lot of what I talk about today is going to be more of a conceptual argument. I'll talk about some empirical work toward the end, but really my goal is just kind of to help us think differently about civic education. And I will be asking for a little participation about halfway through, so get ready. Okay. So when we think about civic education, there's a few. Go that way. No, maybe not. Clickers. So when you look in the news right now, these are 3 headlines that I just pulled up randomly. I could have pulled up many more from the past little less than a year, ever since last year's election. And basically there's a move, and this happens every few years whenever something major happens in the country, is that there's a new call for civics education. And you can see, obviously, Trump's victory is something that's been one of those moments for the country where everyone said, you know what, we have to be doing better in schools. They're calling it a Sputnik moment for civic education. This is not the first time this has been said. This happens every time there seems to be a crisis, a national crisis, or some kind of feeling that the folks in the country don't understand how major things work, such as the Electoral College, for example. There are certain assumptions that tend to be part of all of these narratives. These narratives about why we need civics education tend to always follow the same script. And the script goes something like this. First, we bring up the Founding Fathers. This is a quote from Thomas Jefferson in 1818 as he was helping to establish the University of Virginia, and they were beginning to think about founding a system of K-12 public education. And people always say, when you go back to why our public schools were founded, even though now we are at a place where academics and reading and writing are seen as to be the primary purposes, with civic education being somewhere further down the mix, Founding Fathers believed that public schools were founded for the exact purpose of civic education. So every one time we talk about why we need civics, they're trying to remind us, hey, ever since the beginning, our Founding Fathers have wanted us to have schools for the purpose of becoming better citizens. It's not just about getting into college, not just about getting a career, even though that's the way that our pendulum has swung more recently. The next part of the narrative, which is a very powerful part of the narrative, and they've been saying this since the 1960s, but it never seems to go away, is that we are in crisis. Young people are in crisis in terms of their civic knowledge, skills, and dispositions. So every time there's a new report coming out, it's always that young people don't know any facts about our country, and they don't know how to be engaged, and they don't want to be engaged. They're just a narrative of disengagement for the most part. This is the NAEP civics proficiency levels ever since the late 1990s. We're flat every time they offer the NAEP civics exam to a representative sample of 4th graders, 8th graders, and 12th graders. We're finding no improvement in what young people know about civics education. And if we broke this data down even further, there are always disparities between white and higher income students and students of color and low-income students, where there's even more of a disparity between those two groups. Then skills. This is a map of, and it's kind of hard to see from here, but I'll send you the slides. Just showing that the election in 2016 for the general population was the lowest turnout in about 20 years. And for young people, the numbers are always lower. So when it comes to who's voting, young people aren't getting out the vote. There was a spike in 2008, the election of Barack Obama, and it's going back down. And these are for presidential elections. If we talk about midterm elections, the 2014 midterm election was one of the lowest turnouts that we had ever seen as a country. So while the general population is around 55% of eligible voters go out and vote, for young people in the 2016 election, it was about 5 to 6 percentage points lower. So folks always say young people don't know a lot about our country, they're not getting out to vote. And when Circle, which is a civics education think tank based out of Tufts University, after the 2016 election, they asked young people how they feel about our democracy, and more high percentages, 31% of young people strongly disagree that they feel confident about democracy in the United States, and 35% say they're losing faith in American democracy, and these numbers are rising. So we're getting to a place where not only are folks not sure of the facts of how our country operates, they're not getting out and being part of their civic duty, and they're not very confident that our democracy works in the first place. And so this is, again, these are the narrative of civic education, of why we're in crisis and why we need it. And the third one is political polarization. The Pew Research Center has been studying ever since 1994 kind of how folks' political views differ across the spectrum. This is trying to show that back in 1994, most people, and this is usually true, most people's political views tend to move toward the center. Most people have more in common, and the average voting Democrat and the average voting Republican were not so far apart in their views. Obviously, they had different views, but they were not ideologically completely opposed. That was in 1994. In 2017, it's like folks are drifting apart. We're getting to a place where folks can find no common ground, and our political dialogue, as you can see on cable news, is becoming fractured. It's becoming more and more divisive, more and more hateful, and folks can't find anything that they agree on in the middle anymore. So that kind of sums up this kind of narrative of that's the story that is being told about that's why we need civics. Our founding fathers said we needed it. We're in a crisis where young people aren't getting involved as much, and we need them involved because if we don't, we wind up in the place where we are today where folks can't seem to talk across any kind of difference for any kind of political ideas. And that sounds great. That's a great narrative to tell, but I want to complicate that narrative a little bit. This is kind of the if-then statement. I was inspired by those of you that were at Deborah Ball's talk last week. I like how she used logic and the things that we take for granted in narratives that we tell. And there's kind of an if-then statement here. So the logic behind most dominant civic education programs is if we can just get students to learn more of these civic knowledge and skills and dispositions, if we have civic education in schools, then the result will be that they will participate at higher levels in democratic society, and we will reduce levels of polarization because democracy will be more responsive. It's not a spectator sport. You get more people involved, the democracy will respond, and things will get better. So it's kind of the if-then. That's the logic that is behind this model. There are several assumptions that are hidden within this model that I want to kind of draw out because it seems very normal on the surface, seems like it makes sense, but there's several assumptions that I want to interrogate a little bit. The first of these assumptions of that narrative of if we just do more civics, democracy will get better, is that it's assuming that the infrastructure of democracy is sound. And by that I mean, it means that democracy itself, our system itself is good, it's just that we're not participating in it enough. And if we just participate in it more, it will work because the system itself is sound. This is a long little snippet here, but this comes from the NAEP, which is the National Assessment of Educational Progress. This is their framework of how they go about determining what to assess on the NAEP every 4 years. I won't read the whole thing, I'll have it for you, but the idea here is that it's telling a narrative of our country that is a narrative of straightforward progress. So it's kind of mentioning that yes, we've always had a gap between our nation's ideals and reality, but we have a large degree of consensus about what our country is and what it means, and we've just been moving forward and getting better and better ever since. Like slavery was the bad old days, and we keep moving forward, and things just keep getting better and better in a straight line. And so that's the kind of narrative that American students are learning in their civics ed classes, is that the infrastructure of our society is great, We just need to participate in it more, and it will just keep getting better and better. We'll keep moving forward. The second assumption is that there is a consensus, we all agree, of what good citizenship is. If we agree that we just need to give students more knowledge, skills, and dispositions, and they will participate, we're assuming that we know what it means to be a good citizen and that we all somehow agree about it. This is from a while ago. The researchers are Kirby and Lopez. They're doing a new round of this study right now, so this is kind of dated. But they did a study of kind of what students are studying in their civics courses. And if you go back to the NAEP framework about how we are a country that is exceptional and improving all the time, it makes sense that what we are learning and what we assume a good citizen is someone who celebrates our great American heroes and how great our system of government is, and that we understand our Constitution and how it works. For the most part, students in civics classes are learning a very meritocratic, triumphalist narrative of America. Very few are talking about the problems facing the country today, or racism and other forms of injustice in the American system. That's a much less frequently studied topic. So again, there's this idea that civics is working fine. Our system is working fine. If we just get involved, any of the problems that we have seen in our past in our country will be mitigated because our system is sound. Those assumptions have been questioned over our entire existence as a nation. But there's a book that came out, Ta-Nehisi Coates, who many of you may be familiar with. He's an African-American writer and journalist who works for The Atlantic. He came out with a memoir a few years ago that really exploded called Between the World and Me, and he's now considered probably one of the most foremost African-American public intellectuals of our time right now. This is a longer quote, but I do want to read it because I think this is what really made me think about the new conceptual model that I wanted to pose for civics education, because he's talking about this idea. What we're basically talking about so far is the American dream. It's the story that if we participate, that we live in an exceptional nation and that we can do exceptional things if you just work hard and you do your civic duty. Ta-Nehisi Coates is telling a different story, and this is what he wrote. He said, "This is the foundation of the American dream. Its adherents must not just believe in it, but believe that it is just. Believe that their possession of the dream is the natural result of grit, honor, and good works. There is some passing acknowledgement of the bad old days, which, by the way, were not so bad as to have any ongoing effect on our present. The mettle that it takes to look away from the horror of our prison system, from police forces transformed into armies, from the long war against the black body, is not forged overnight. This is the practiced habit of jabbing out one's eyes and forgetting the work of one's hands. To acknowledge these horrors means turning away from the brightly rendered vision of your country as it has always declared itself and turning towards something murkier and unknown. It is still too difficult for most Americans to do this." And I wanted to read that whole quote because, number one, he's a beautiful writer. We all aspire to this kind of writing. But also because I was really taken, as someone who studies civic education, somebody who's interested in civic learning for young people, I was really taken by how he's talking about turning away from a brightly rendered vision of our country and turning towards something murkier and unknown. And I was like, well, what is that? What is that murkier and unknown vision of our country? And what would it mean to look at it and use that as a new frame for civic learning, to not just look at the only vision of our civics being one of constant forward progress. So that's kind of got me thinking about this idea of, let's kind of go back that narrative that I just told you. Ta-Nehisi Coates is encouraging us to look at that narrative from a completely different perspective. So let's rewind to that nice narrative about how our founders wanted schools to be places of civic learning first. That was in 1818. We know that in 1818, folks who were considered citizens were mostly white landed men. So there were many people that weren't even part of this narrative in the first place, and continue to not be part of this narrative through a lot of the battles that we see going on around gerrymandering, voter ID laws, folks that are like the active efforts to get people to not go out and vote or to not be able to exercise their right to vote. So number one, that kind of narrative that we've always had civics has always been an ideal, is problematized right off the bat. The second thing we talked about was polarization. The idea that polarization will get better if we just give students more civic education implies that somehow these political views are just views that are equally valid. Like, we could have any political view and we can work together as a nation. We're getting to a point where our political discourse isn't just about, hey, I believe in low taxes if you believe in high taxes. We're getting to a point where a lot of our political dialogue involves fundamental questions of whose identity gets to be accepted as being an American citizen. So we've got white supremacist marches on the news all across the country. folks talking about taking our country back, an us versus them narrative, where folks are even getting, this isn't just about having different views, it's about some people believing that other people should not have a right to be in the system in the first place. And in that kind of situation, we're not just talking about, hey, let's educate everyone to say that any political view is okay as long as you participate. It's a little bit different when we're talking about some people who feel like they are not allowed to be part of the conversation in the first place. So that gets a little dicier. And then the fact that we have, and I can give you all the citations for this in the article, but the fact that we're living in a time when wealth disparities, housing, criminal justice, in almost every institution of public life, we have huge disparities between people of color and white folks and high income and low income folks. And especially the wealth disparities. The American Political Science Association put out a report saying that basically politicians are listening to the folks that are donating the most money. So the folks who have the resources get the ear of government officials, and those who do not have the resources, they said, speak with a whisper to our American government system. So the idea that the system works the way it should, and if we all just do more and get involved, it will be more responsive. Ta-Nehisi Coates would argue that that argument is flawed from the beginning, and that all the narratives that speak to how civics education is currently structured in America don't speak to a large percentage of young people in our schools right now. Doesn't speak to their lived experiences, and is not engaging to them because it's not relevant to their lives and to what they are experiencing. And again, the third part of the argument of civics, is that we have this crisis of civic knowledge, skills, and dispositions that young people don't know enough, they don't do enough, and they don't care enough. But when we do a further study, Judith Torney-Aperta, who's one of the foremost civic education scholars in the country, has looked through all of the state standards for civic education, which most states have, and say that they basically offer encyclopedic details about government structures, and that these standards basically have little or no meaning to students because they don't connect to their identities as citizens. What most students learned in their civics classes, as we said, was how the Constitution works, how the three branches of government work. It's just a bunch of facts about democracy as opposed to making it relevant to how young people themselves might be able to or interested in participating in the system. And this is where I'm going to stop for a second. Actually, I'm going to go back before you see that. When it comes to skills, I'm going to ask you to take a moment, find someone who's close to you, make eye contact, smile. And I want you to think about this question. Today, if someone is a good citizen, and obviously that's a subjective term, as you understand what it means to be a good citizen, what are some of the behaviors of a good citizen? What does a good citizen do? What are some skills that they have or behaviors that they engage in? So turn to somebody near you for a moment. What do you think a good citizen knows how to do? Or what do they go out and do besides voting? All right, I'm sorry to stop the conversation, but we're going to have more time to talk about it. Let's come back together. I'll do my classroom. Clap once if you can hear me. Works every time. Can I get a few people to share out what are some of the behaviors of a good citizen? What does a good citizen do?
Knowing who your local representatives are.
So knowing who your local representatives are, and if we wanted to take it to skills, maybe knowing how to contact them, how to communicate with them. Awesome.
We came up with being well informed on issues, but also participating in community life, whether that's, you know, neighborhood events, or I was thinking of NGOs being involved in nonprofits.
Staying informed, getting involved somehow at either the local, national, international level, doing something. Awesome. Can I get one more?
Paying taxes.
Paying taxes, right? Part of our civic duty, which is being debated right now. The reason I wanted you to think about this is that we have measures of civic skills. So when folks are doing research on civic education, pretty much for the past 30 years, we've been using the same measures to show who's a good citizen and the kinds of behaviors that we want students to go out and do when they become citizens. And then some of them, a lot of them are completely valid over time. The same behaviors that were true in 1960 are true today, like you're talking about voting, getting involved, staying informed. But I would argue that we're getting to a place right now where some of these measures are not capturing the new forms of engagement that are cropping up in the past 10 to 20 years as a result of things like the digital revolution, right? And some of them just don't make a lot of sense anymore, but a lot of this narrative around civic skills and how we talk about how there's been a decline of society, how we all used to be this kumbaya, happy, like everyone used to be. Robert Putnam has a famous book, Bowling Alone, that we used to have civic associations, we used to get together, and we don't do that anymore. It's always the narrative is that, and usually what's interesting is that a lot of these are some of the measures that are often used to measure civic engagement is regular church attendance or union membership, which just don't kind of, especially now in the ways that unions have been kind of dismantled, don't even make a lot of sense anymore as measures of civic engagement. Daily newspaper reading speaks to the idea of being civically informed, but also the Pew Research Center shows us that most people don't read newspapers anymore. They stay informed by going online, by using social media. So they're staying informed in different ways. And I think that our civic education literature and research has not quite caught up to the different ways that we can be involved. And so it's telling a narrative that in some ways is set up to create a decline, to create a sense of failure, because people aren't doing the things that we've been saying forever are the only ways to measure being a good citizen. And so I want us to keep thinking about, like, well, how could we measure things differently today to get to the ways that young people might be more interested in being engaged. And in terms of that civic dispositions, how we say how horrible it is that young people today don't believe in democracy. Kathy Cohen at the University of Chicago has done a lot of great work around how for many young people of color who have seen the danger that they can experience in the public sphere when we're talking about police violence, the things we see on the news, that for many young people, the idea of not getting involved isn't necessarily a failure on their part, it's actually a choice. It's a politics of invisibility that is a matter of protecting themselves because of the danger that they can experience when they are out in the public sphere that doesn't seem to be responsive to them and can actually be dangerous to them. So it's kind of flipping our ideas about this kind of narrative of a failed citizen, of young people, especially young people of color and low-income young people, not achieving civically. There's actually talk out there about a civic achievement gap as well as an academic achievement gap. And that language makes it sound like kids are failing to achieve this ideal of citizenship. And I'm going to be asking us to kind of question whether that ideal even makes sense. And if it doesn't, then how can we do it differently in a way that speaks to all young people? So that's kind of where we are right now. Folks are starting to question this idea of citizenship as a status that one can either achieve or not achieve. At some level, as we're talking about dreamers, citizenship on one level is a legal status, but on another level, and the way that my co-author and I in the paper were talking about, it's about being engaged in a local and national and international community. And what would it mean to think about citizenship not as just something that you achieve of being good at or bad at, but as a practice that is dependent upon your social and cultural and historical environment, something that is negotiated and is mediated by the what's going on in your world and how your community is being treated. How can we look at citizenship from that perspective as opposed to one of just being one that you need to get to by believing in the American dream narrative and participating in prescribed ways? So that's kind of where we got to this idea of, we talk about civic participation, we talk about engagement, and this might seem like a little semantic argument, but I'm using it as a way to kind of push us forward, that participation and engagement assumes that you are working within a system that is responsive and that is functional. I'm arguing that that system is not functional, so the words participation and engagement don't quite capture where I think that youth civic engagement is going. I'm not saying that folks should not participate in the system as it is, but I think that what we're arguing is that this idea of thinking of interrogation and innovation is a space where young people are starting to carve out new ways of engaging in the civic sphere that is not simply about accepting the system as it is and conforming to it, but actually seeking to change, question, and do something different within that system to push it in the direction that they want it to go. So that's what we were exploring in this article. a few different ways that young people are doing that. I'm not going to be able to explore all of them in depth right now, but the two main ones that we focused on in the article are youth participatory action research, a form of youth engagement, which I'm going to talk about a little, and also the idea of participatory politics and using the online space for civic engagement. So I'm going to start with YPAR, which is one that I've been more involved with. I've done a lot of empirical work around the impact of YPAR on young people, which I'm not going to talk as much about all of the different folks that are researchers in YPAR, but essentially, if you're not familiar with the term, it's a mode of inquiry that is named for who performs it, the central actors, which are youth, the processes through which research is conducted, which is participatory, and the purpose of that research, which is action, to take social action. So the idea of YPAR, the ideas about YPAR stretch all the way back to the foundations of John Locke, talking about empiricism, positivism. We're talking about YPAR has been around, the ideas about YPAR have been around for a very long time, but the term kind of exploded in around 2008 with the publication of two books, one by Michelle Fine and Julio Camarota, and another one by Ernest Morel and Jeff Duncan Andrade, who kind of brought up this idea of YPAR, youth participatory action research. It became a big thing, and it's still kind of a new thing today in civic education. But the idea here is that we often think of research as something objective and neutral, and something that folks with credentials are the ones that have to do. YPAR is about positioning young people as the experts of their own experiences and changing what can count as research to include things like spoken word, oral histories, community wisdom, community cultural wealth, and using research and knowledge production as a form of seeking to change the world. Now, my experience in YPAR, and we're going to talk a little bit about, as we look through all the research around YPAR, this is in the article, we kind of created this cycle of civic learning and development that is different than this cycle of traditional civic learning and development, which I'm going to kind of go through each of these one by one by telling one story to kind of illustrate what YPAR is about. And I'd be happy to talk more about more of the research around it. But most of my experience, one of the parts of YPAR is about connecting to pursue social action. Most of my experience with YPAR has been from my time at UCLA, where I helped to coordinate a group called the UCLA Council of Research for about 8 years. These are some of our young people. It was a group that was started by Dr. John Rogers and Dr. Ernest Morel at UCLA when they were asked by the Santa Monica School District to come into their schools and talk to them and tell them about why they were experiencing such disparities of achievement between their white and Asian students and their Black and Latino students. They asked them as researchers from UCLA to come in, and they're like, tell us what's going on. Can you do research and tell us what's happening? And John and Ernest said, after some reflection, maybe we should talk to the young people who go to the school and live it every day, and they can tell us a little bit more about why the situation is happening, instead of just turning to us as the official sanctioned researchers. So they got a group of students together from that school. It eventually turned into a group of about 30 young people from schools across South and East LA that we would bring together to UCLA every summer and then work with throughout the school year and give presentations to stakeholders from City Hall all the way to community groups. So it's kind of, I wrote about it in a book that came out a few years ago from Routledge called Doing YPAR that I can give you more information about. But obviously one of the first things about YPAR is that it involves connecting with a purpose of social action. So YPAR groups come together in order to privilege young people thinking about civic action in a different way. Another important thing about YPAR is identifying multiple perspectives, especially on public education. Our YPAR group was about looking at the issues that mattered most to the young people in their lives, and one of those was obviously education. And I'm going to tell a story about one YPAR student group and kind of how they went through the process, just to give you a sense. Some of you might know about this movie. This came out a while ago, called Waiting for Superman. It was a documentary about the American educational system. And just from the image here, you get a sense of the narrative that it's trying to tell about the quality of the education that is around young people. It's just kind of like chaos and destruction. One of the main points of the film is that we need school reform and we need charter schools because the community schools that most young people are going to are not preparing them for life. Basically, young people are waiting for a Superman to come along and save them from their community schools. In that movie, they tell a narrative about one of the high schools that I was working with, and it was part of our Council of Youth Research in East LA called Roosevelt High School. And if you watch the film, they follow a young person who's in middle school who's got dreams. You know, they're telling a story of a young woman that you identify with, and they're saying that if she goes on her path forward in her education without any change, she will wind up at Roosevelt High School. And they basically claim that that's a dropout factory, and that she stays at Roosevelt High School, she will not be able to get to college because of their poor graduation rate. And my young people saw this film, and they're using facts in this film. So we're talking about different kinds of research, right? There were facts that were true about the struggles that Roosevelt High School was going through. But the young people saw that they never talked to anyone from the community. They never talked to the young people. Roosevelt High School was a bastion in the community of the East LA blowouts in the 1960s. And that a lot of the things that they were saying about their school had happened because of a lack of social investment. And that it was not just the fault of the people that were in the building themselves, who they thought were working really hard every day. So the young people were really upset to see that their school was basically labeled as a dropout factory, and they were pretty much considered, if they went there, they had no hope and no hope for the future. So this idea of identifying multiple perspectives was young people that came to the council would often internalize deficit perspectives of themselves and their communities until they were shown that there were different ways to think about it, right? So we would introduce social theory, and we would talk to young people about the different conditions that influence folks. We're talking about individual agency, but also social reproduction. And the same things that we read in graduate school, we would obviously do a lot of scaffolding, but we would read the same texts with high school students. So they're reading Freire, they're reading a few different things. When we're talking about developing critical consciousness, this comes from the article by Daniel Solorzano and Dolores Delgado Bernal, who talk about the different forms of resistance that young people experience in schools. A lot of times when young people resist what's going on in schools, we assume that they're just pretty much defeating themselves, right? When they see injustice, I won't go into the whole theory behind this, but the idea is that when young people are motivated by social justice, but they don't understand the systemic issues that are working against them, they often tend to conform to the system as it is. YPAR is about getting to a place of transformation where we understand that we want social justice, we understand that there is oppression and systemic forces working against us, and we resist by transforming the system. And that's what YPAR is about. So as young people went through their research, they basically talked to members of their community in East LA, they talked to their teachers, they talked to the kinds of stakeholders at the state level, we talked to the governor. So we were able to put a lot of steps in place that young people could get a lot of information. But this is a PowerPoint slide that they wound up creating, that they presented to the mayor and to other stakeholders in Los Angeles. And they said, you know what, we want to tell a different story that Waiting for Superman is telling based on our research, where they interviewed folks in their community. They did a survey of everyone in their school. They did lots of different forms of data collection that we would consider research, but also did a lot of personal oral history. And they said, you know what, you're saying that we are just a dropout factory and that we are failing, but we have found through our research that there's all these oppressive decisions that are affecting our community from the outside, including budget cuts, the ticketing that they were doing to the truant students, inequitable distribution of resources, and it's creating an oppressive ecology that we're trying to overcome. So they're telling a different narrative. They're exerting a critical consciousness to be engaged because they are speaking to stakeholders, and they're looking at the data that we would want young people to be looking at to be civically engaged, but they're using it to call for social transformation. And these are them when they gave their, part of YPAR is also about being creative and having fun. So the young people were trying to say that they don't need a Superman to come and save them because they are their own superheroes. So this is our group presenting that this year. Oscar, of course, didn't get the memo. He wasn't wearing a shirt, but everybody else was wearing their superhero shirts. And they presented this presentation. We tried to make sure that young people were able to share their research with many different constituencies. So in addition to speaking to the mayor and to traditional folks in power, this presentation was at the UCLA Labor Center, which was to a group of parents and community members so that they could appreciate and learn from their research as well. The year that this group was doing their research, we actually were able to take them to the American Educational Research Association, AERA's annual meeting, which that year was in New Orleans. That was back in 2011. And it was the first time a lot of students have been able to leave Los Angeles, go on a plane, especially to New Orleans. So that's why I have like gray hairs from taking 30 high school kids around New Orleans for a week. But they were able to present this research to adult researchers in education who are, again, we gather every year at AERA to talk about young people, to talk about how to improve education, but we don't see young people at the conference to hear from their voice. So we were able to bring young people there, get adult researchers to listen to their voices. And one of the students after the trip, we were talking about critical civic praxis, the idea that we're always acting and reflecting. One of our students, Caesar, who had previously been one of the students who I love to teach in class, but can be really, he's the kind of student that's brilliant, but is not achieving up to his potential because he's always questioning the teacher and saying, why do we have to do this? He knows the system is messed up, but didn't quite know how to put that into transformative action. He was just self-defeating himself and not doing well in school. And YPower became an outlet, and this is what he was talking about, that going to New Orleans helped him to see himself as a revolutionary. It helped him to see that he would not sit around and take oppression, but become someone who will advocate for change. Caesar has since graduated, and one of the teachers who we work with went up to Oakland in California to start a new school, and he's now an assistant at that school and is training to become a teacher. Some of the other students that you saw in that slide have become teachers and gone back to Roosevelt High School. So in the book, we do a lot of research, and I won't go into it all right now, but we've done a lot of research longitudinally studying this cohort of students that engage in YPAR and the long-term effects that this can have on them for their civic engagement, but it was not the kind of traditional civic learning that we'd see in a lot of the dominant paradigms that are out there. It's something different. And then I want to stop so I don't have too much time, but I'm going to briefly touch on the other way that we were arguing that we could do critical civic learning, and that is through something called participatory politics. That is a new term that's come out. Joe Kahn from the University UC Riverside has been instrumental in starting to think about this. Black Lives Matter and the Dreamer movement are two examples of young people. These are movements started by young people where they're using social media to change the agenda of the public conversation. Everyone in here knows about these two movements, and that's because of how young people have been able to leverage the affordances of social media and get elected officials and folks talking about their issues. So participatory politics is the idea of using not just online tools, but interactive, youth-driven, interest-driven tools to get young people to influence public opinion on issues that matter to them. Some of the things that are interesting about this form of politics is that, number one, it's based on students' interests. So young people are using the kinds of networks that we see all the time at Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat. Folks think networks that are often considered dangerous because of privacy concerns and also just recreational. It's kind of considered like selectivism for young people to be online and not be doing anything else. But folks are starting to see that if we can guide young people in their use of social media tools, that we can actually turn that form of civic engagement into something more sustained and lifelong. Interesting thing about this kind of thing is that it bypasses traditional civic gatekeepers. You don't have to go through a political party official to get this done. You don't have to go through a news anchor to get onto a cable news, the way that we traditionally get civic information. These are young people spreading knowledge, spreading information across these social networks. There are obviously lots of issues that go on with fake news, and this is why we need more, I would argue we need more explicit instruction about civic engagement through social media. But unfortunately, a lot of the curriculums that are out there right now in digital citizenship tend to be basically curriculum that teaches young people about their digital footprint and how they need to protect themselves. So if you've ever gone onto Facebook and seen the teacher post a picture and say, like, show my students that nothing you put on Facebook is private, spread this all over the country and the world, show them that anything you put online can be shared. It's a very protectionist stance that is basically like we need to be scared and see social media as a source of risk, as opposed to managing that risk and finding out how we can use it to spark social action and to work with each other to do something different. And because it's young people, and because it's online a lot of times, and it's people creating videos, it's creating memes, being on Twitter, it's often creative, and it's making civic learning not just about learning the three branches of government. It's about blending your personal, cultural, political expression, going online and seeing the new hashtag that's popped up. It's creative and it's exciting and it's moving fast. So we're getting to a place where we're starting to do a little more study, and a new study that I'm going to start working on is young people who are doing participatory politics in their schools and how that influences their long-term civic identity development. The other interesting thing about participatory politics is that it erases a lot of the disparities by race that we see in other forms of civic engagement. Even though there's a lot of talk about the digital divide, most studies are showing that 95% of young people across different racial backgrounds have access to the internet, usually through their phones. And that when they looked at a study, Kathy Cohen and Joe Kahn did a study about young people engaging in participatory politics, they found that basically there was no statistical significant difference across racial groups in people engaging in this practice. So it could be a way in, even though it's not the end point, if young people across the board are interested and engaged in this form of civic learning, that we can use this as a way to get a larger percentage of our young people involved in different forms of civic learning like YPAR and eventual larger forms of civic engagement. So again, some of the things that we would not normally consider civic engagement that participatory politics is encouraging us to think about. We've got all kinds of traditional forms which are important and continue to be important. We're not arguing to get rid of them. We're just arguing that they need to be supplemented by some new forms of engagement. So starting or joining a political group on a social networking site is a form of political action that young people can get involved in. And again, the age of 13 is when we usually consider young people having agency to go on to these different social media sites. So we're talking about voting usually happens at 18. We usually consider everyone under 18 to be like citizens in training, not quite be a citizen just yet. On social media, we have a place where young people can kind of take the lead in their own civic learning. Posting or forwarding someone else's political commentary or news, creating your own content, going to an event where young people are sharing their views. Young people are very engaged in boycotting and boycotting. Boycotting means that you intentionally buy from a place because of their political views, as opposed to not buying from them, just a boycott. I had to learn that. But these are not, again, some people look at these acts and call them slacktivism. They say that, yeah, young people might share something online, they might like something on Facebook or Twitter, but that doesn't translate to anything. There are no long-term studies yet showing that there's a direct correlation between participatory politics and other sustained forms of civic engagement, but we're getting to a place where we're arguing that there could very well be a pathway if we can integrate these kinds of politics into civic learning, instead of just treating civic learning the way that it has been treated for a long time, which is textbook based and is based on that old narrative of the American dream. This could be a more relevant and interesting way to get young people engaged. And there's research going on right now to try to build that literature. One quick thing I want to show you before we start talking is that there's a way you can get involved in this right now. The National Writing Project, which is a group that I'm deeply involved in, has bought the rights to this article. One of the things that's frustrating a lot of times about academic research, especially when you're interested in civic engagement, is that these articles are always behind firewalls, and if you're not associated with a place like Rutgers, you can't get them. So a lot of the teachers that I've worked with, the young people that I've worked with in the council, they can't read this work. So the National Writing Project bought the rights to this article, and if you type into Google, the link is too long, but if you type into Google writing our civic futures, you'll wind up getting to this website. And this article that I've been talking about today is going to be up here all during the month of November for folks to annotate. And so you can click on it right here. And it's pretty cool. It's this new tool called Hypothesis. And they're all about social annotation and how reading an article can become a social and civic process. So you can see there's 42 threads, and this just started last weekend. And there's like over 100 annotations, and you can go through this and you basically see like people are picking out different phrases and people are talking about it, and we're creating a dialogue, and you can add content. So this is basically making sure that no piece of research becomes dead as soon as it gets published. It can be living and a conversation can continue. So if you're interested, look up Writing Your Civic Futures, and you can actually get involved in annotating this piece, which is kind of cool. And if you'd like to know more about it, let me know. And I will stop there. And I'm a big fan of Twitter, as I am a fan of participatory politics, so follow me on Twitter or email me if you have more questions. But thank you. So yeah, if there's stuff that you talked about in your pair share or other questions or concerns, I'm excited to start a dialogue about what you think about civic learning today.
I was wondering, when you interact with involved in the research, what is your part? Like, how do you interact with them? How do you provide them tools?
I should say about YPAR, Beth wasn't able to be here today, but Beth Rubin, one of our colleagues, is also instrumental in YPAR, and we've got YPAR going on right now in New Brunswick for the pre-service teacher candidates. And the interesting thing about YPAR, especially when it's in the context of teacher education, is that it forces a different kind of relationship than the traditional hierarchical teacher-student relationship. Because YPAR is about highlighting young people's knowledge, it really encourages adults to be facilitators rather than the transmitters of knowledge. And at the same time, though, adults have a very particular and important role to play in YPAR. I've seen some folks that are interested in doing YPAR, and so they say, well, the young people have to do it, so I'm just going to step back and basically like like go, like they just do what they want. But that's not really how it works, because number one, young people have been socialized into a system where they're waiting for adults to tell them what to do. It takes a long time to break out of that mold. It's not like young people are going to suddenly be like, okay, I'm going to start this whole project. They don't know like where to go. And plus adults, we have the resources to set them up with folks they can interview, places they can go to. So adults have a role to play. It's not about ceding our responsibility. It's about thinking of our role in a very different way. So my role during the council was to, we created an umbrella. So the year that the young people did their research happened to be an important year in California because it was an anniversary of a court case about young people deserving access to an equitable education. And so we thought, hey, we can get a lot of media attention if young people are researching the different aspects of what they deserve in terms of an equitable education. So they chose their own topics of what they wanted to research, but we created a frame that would help them get the resources they needed to make the research happen and then to get attention for it after it was done. So it's definitely a lot about, we call it carpool pedagogy, is that a lot of the instruction happens when you're driving young people to an interview and they're listening to the radio. It's completely different than a formal classroom environment. It's about listening to young people. It's about building relationships with them that can then get to this kind of really vulnerable and deep civic learning. So that's kind of how we look at it.
I wonder how you would expect somebody to adapt this productively if they were doing white part in a predominantly white rural school.
It's interesting because one of the years that we did YPAR in Los Angeles, it gained a lot of steam, and so the politicians were starting to demand that if we wanted some funding that we would have to bring in different schools, not just schools that were predominantly students of color, low-income schools. And I would say we didn't do a great job the year that we integrated a wealthier white school into the program. But I believe there are some folks that do YPAR with white and rural folks. There's issues obviously of access to different research opportunities, but I think that the digital sphere can moderate that a little bit. But I think that I'm really interested in the next phase of YPAR is thinking about doing YPAR with young folks who have privilege, because I think it's just as useful for them to interrogate where their privilege comes from, how systems of oppression work in their favor and not in the favor of other students. A lot of people ask me about, isn't YPAR dangerous because don't kids just get angry when they see how the system works? Like, so we talk about systemic oppression, we talk about how the systems of housing and healthcare and all these things interact together, and it seems difficult to break out and have any social mobility. And then from the side of white students, sometimes they get defensive about thinking about, hey, I worked really hard, my family's worked really hard, I don't want to hear that we are benefiting from some kind of privilege that I don't see. So on both sides, it can be a discouraging conversation if it's not very carefully, I mean, there's a lot of very carefully planned instruction that has to guide students into thinking about this in a way that can become empowering instead of disempowering. So for the most part, all the young people that I've worked with of color, it's not that they get angry. They come into YPAR assuming a deficit lens about themselves and their community. They buy into the narrative that we're just not doing things right, we don't try hard enough, we don't use our resources correctly. And it takes learning about all these systemic forms of inequality that helps them to see, oh, it's not just, there are individual choices here, but there is a larger social ecology at play, and it actually becomes an empowering conversation. My goal is to figure out how to make sure that that same conversation could happen with white students in a way where it's not, how do we get through the defensiveness and show that it's not about personal guilt, but about a more systemic view of society. That's what we're trying to do with our teacher education students right now in our urban education class.
But I can imagine that somebody with a different perspective might take YPAR and say, we'll do YPAR to show how Obamacare is oppressing this rural community and keeping us from realizing our full potential.
Yeah, although I think YPAR, one of the interesting things is that YPAR is getting widespread in schools, not under the name of YPAR anymore. It's called Action Civics. So it's becoming a bigger part of the civic education community. These Action Civics programs are popping up. It kind of looks like YPAR in some ways, like young people identify a problem, they do research on it, they collect their own data, they present it. So it sounds like basically YPAR, but we're arguing that it's not YPAR and it's co-opting, it's taking the process without the critical element to it. And when you do that, you're stripping away the most important part of what makes it YPAR and of looking at society from the perspective of critical race theory. But yeah, I think there are folks that are doing YPAR and also they wind up working within the system as opposed to critiquing the system, which will be an interesting challenge moving forward.
Something from the webinar group was having a lively conversation.
Is there a way to read that later? I want to read that.
So we've won. Ariana is saying that many of the best citizens she knows are not legal citizens. So what are the limits of the term citizen itself?
Yeah, we've been thinking a lot. We have a whole paragraph in the article. We were lucky enough as we were writing this piece for review of research and education. We had someone that was giving us, like a managing editor, giving us feedback, and they encouraged us to include a whole paragraph of kind of defining and problematizing the term citizen itself. I think we might be at a place where we need to think about a different, because using that term automatically implies legal status when part of what we're pushing against and part of what we're criticizing is the fact that there are young people who are deeply civically engaged but don't have the official label of citizen. I think that's part of where something like the Dreamer movement is so powerful. But yeah, we haven't figured out, we basically created a lot of explanation for that. We tried to account for that in our piece. And I think being explicit about that and how problematic that term is part of the solution, but it's definitely not the whole solution. And so we're at a place where young people are coming to classrooms and they're learning about a narrative of America that they are explicitly not included in. And we haven't figured out kind of like what the next step is of, obviously YPAR is an important part of them interrogating the idea of citizenship, so that's an important practice. But I think as a field we have to think about how to change the language around citizenship to make it a more inclusive term.
Do you primarily work with pre-service teachers at Rutgers, or what classes are you teaching programs?
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, I'm not repeating questions. The question was about the groups of students that I'm working with now as a primarily pre-service teachers. So yes, now, previously I was a high school English teacher, worked with high school youth for the most part. YPAR has now been extended all the way down into elementary school, so it is possible to do YPAR with students as young as 3rd, 4th, 5th grade. But now it's interesting looking at YPAR as a strategy for transformative teacher education, and Beth has been doing this work for years now, and now I'm starting to get involved in, this will be my first year being involved in the New Brunswick community doing YPAR. And I think it's really important for teachers for several reasons. Number one, we're still in a place where pre-service teachers are seeing learning during the school day that is still very much influenced by standardized testing standards. Having an after-school YPAR space where young people can, where the pre-service teachers can interact with young people in a more fluid and socio-emotional kind of way is really important. But also for them to see that a lot of the activities that are happening in YPAR are standards-based. So after I graduated from my doctoral program and from the working with the council, I actually went back and taught high school for a year before I wound up getting into a postdoc and then my academic positions. And after having that experience with the council, I knew that I needed to do YPAR even if I was in a classroom space, and I needed to figure out how to do that. So it is possible, even though the council program is an after-school space, so we had a lot of resources, a lot of freedom. We didn't have the constraints of testing or standards. When I got into a space that did have those constraints, I had to figure out how to make YPAR work in that space, and it is possible. I was lucky to have an administration that was flexible, but as I say over and over again, the Common Core literacy standards, you could support every single piece of what young people do in YPAR through the standards. They're collecting information, they're making claims with evidence. You know, anything that we want young people to be doing in schools, we can be doing through YPAR. So it is possible, and I think that having pre-service teachers see what's possible and to think beyond kind of the traditional form of instruction that we often see in schools is kind of the next powerful thing to think about. I think that's our next vein of research about YPAR. It's really cool. 1 and then 2.
So I guess it's more of a continuation of what you're just describing. Is it possible to, like, is there an ideal age for students to be a part of YPAR? So can it go beyond secondary education, and does it have to go into, you know, for instance, we're just talking about student teachers, maybe people outside of that, and I think part of that, what I'm trying to get at is there can be a lot of resistance, like after a certain age, perhaps, I don't know what the actual numbers are, but, you know, once people sort of become an adult, they might have more solidified ideas about how the world works. And we know that people of all different groups have deficit beliefs about marginalized people. So,
yeah, and the question was about whether or not YPAR can be used with populations beyond the K-12 population, and we're getting up towards not even just pre-service teachers, but into just adulthood. That's a great question. I think there are groups that are trying to do that. I think YPAR has gotten a lot further in the nonprofit community and in after-school spaces and even adult educational spaces than in schools, because of the fact that it can be so fluid and so, you know, you need kind of that freedom in a lot of ways. This work has been done. It's happening right now in Rikers in New York City, which I'm working to connect with the folks there. There are folks that do YPAR with inmates in prison to kind of understand more about how they got to the position they got to. And the interesting thing there is that you're not allowed to have you're not allowed to be on the internet and stuff like that, so that the folks that are in the prison that are doing the research have to explain what they want, and then the folks that are part of the nonprofit then go out and like create it for them and bring it back in and kind of like have to like do it through like a telephone situation, which is kind of interesting. But I think, yeah, there's I think more and more we're getting to a place where, and especially in today's political climate where folks feel like they can't speak to each other, I think there's a lot of nonprofits that are interested in getting adults to consider their own experiences. And I think a lot of times the most powerful way that starts is through storytelling. So there's a lot of nonprofit groups now that are starting to work with folks of all age levels to kind of tell their personal stories and then use a lot of this literature to get themselves into the path of critical consciousness. One of the things that I argue as an English teacher, and I was talking about this earlier with Rosemary, is that civic education is often associated only with social studies in schools. All the civic standards are always through social studies. Any conferences, all that stuff, publications are usually geared to social studies. As an English teacher, I'm trying to change that and say that English and literacy is a key driver of civic learning. And one of the reasons for that is that we have access to creative texts like novels. And the great philosopher Maxine Greene wrote a whole book about how art releases the social imagination. So when we are able to read and empathize with characters who are not like us, see worlds that are not our own, we need to be able to imagine more just worlds before we can go out and create them. So literature is being used in a lot of programs, even with adults. With veterans, I've seen a lot of different programs that are using literature as a way in to folks opening kind of their mind and moving out of their kind of deeply held beliefs to think about a new world. And that kind of leads into thinking about YPAR. So yeah, I think there's a lot of exciting possibilities for doing this outside of the traditional K-12 population. Going in then.
Mine actually follows nicely with Brandon's. So looking at whether it's a non-formal educator or a classroom teacher, how do you train practitioners who are already in practice to implement this, which is such a departure to how most teachers have been trained?
The way I've been able to do it is that I've been lucky enough to have like professional learning communities where I always say the first time, if you're going to learn about PAR, and I should say YPAR is an offshoot of PAR, just participatory action research, which can be done with any population. And I think people have to experience it before they can teach it. So anytime I work with, so even our students right now in the pre-service program, they're going to be doing a small PAR project in their sites where they are looking at a problem of practice and just kind of deconstructing it, looking in the research for where this problem has been attacked before. And they're going to be doing small interventions in their classrooms to explore data collection and to analyze that data. So I feel like the first way for teachers to get a sense of how to do it is to experience the process as a learner themselves, and then to think, then we kind of switch between doing it and then the meta perspective of looking at it from afar and being like, okay, what do I need to do? What are the moves that I have to make as a teacher in order to help other people learn how to do this? I think it takes a long time, and we were lucky. The council is one of the longest running YPAR programs that we ever knew of. It went on for about 12 years, so we had generations of students, that came through. It takes a long time to get going, and then once it gets going, it needs to be sustained. And the problem is that folks move on, foundations move their priorities. So we lost funding, because this is cool for a while and then it goes away. I do think finding a way to do it in schools with the constraints that we have, but still making it work is possible, but it needs to have that kind of sustained teacher learning that's happening before they can go in and do it themselves.
Yeah, so, well, thank you. So you make a strong case that YPAR, individual strengthens the agency of these young people, right? It's the agency. But do you, and I guess this goes to Willie's and just Clark's question too, do you also think that it changes perspectives?
Repeat the question. Oh, yeah. The question was, even though we could see pretty strongly that YPAR is influencing the agency of young people who engage in it, do we have evidence that it is changing anyone else's perspectives, or are they just kind of like screaming into the void? One of my colleagues that was involved in the council work, Melanie Bertrand, who's at Arizona State, she has done research on the administrators and public officials that would listen to the YPAR presentations and what the effect it would be on them, and did find that there are several categories of people that how they respond to YPAR. There are some folks who say, "Isn't this cute that young people are doing this and getting up in front of the room and sharing research, just like they're little mini researchers." And adults, some of them don't take their findings seriously, and they just kind of see it as an exercise or mimicry. So there's that group of adults that aren't quite willing to take it seriously or to have their perspective changed. Then there's the biggest group of people who respond to YPAR presentations is that it does change their attitudes and opinions about what young people are capable of. It helps them to see young people differently. That's usually educators, administrators, and sometimes some of the public officials would gain a slightly deeper appreciation for young people as young citizens who they need to start talking to and thinking about when they give their public speeches. There was a small percentage of people that would actually take action based on what the young people found. So we would talk a lot with young people about, the arc of the moral universe and how long it is, and how the purpose of YPAR is not primarily having the changes happen immediately. But because we are exploring education, for example, one of the findings from one of the YPAR presentations was that students didn't have access to their counselors because every time students were on lunch, the counselors were also on lunch. So if they wanted to go see them, they weren't available. And that was something they talked about during a YPAR presentation, and the principal took that into account and said, all right, let's change that. So they changed it, counselor schedules, and something actually changed. That's obviously really exciting for young people and makes their agency go even higher when something concretely changes. But that doesn't always have to be the case. Most of the time, some of the issues that they're talking about changing would involve multiple levels of society and institutions changing, public will changing, which is going to take a lot longer. But we have found some promising signs that when adults hear the presentations, especially when we frame them in the right way towards making demands and students understanding the audience they're speaking to, that it can have some effect on at least how they think about young people, if not how they would actually work differently. But our goal is to obviously think about how to extend those changes, and maybe we've thought about it when some of the young people have done professional developments for their teachers and administrators and actually lead PD sessions to actually help teachers let go of some of their power and see them as co-learners. That's our goal.
I have a request if you could put up the site where.
The annotation thing. Yeah, I think this is it's really cool. I wish that I wish we could have open access to all of our articles, but it's really cool to have a space where it's opening the conversation up. We've got a debate going on the site right now. It's really fun to see what people are talking about and being able to engage with folks.
So in a higher education setting, where do we go from changing the students wanting to participate in civic engagement to them actually participating? I'm thinking of two examples from this year. One was with the executive order travel ban in DACA. We had the protest on College Avenue, and I know a lot of students are interested in student activism, and we had a lot of students there. But if even half the students that wanted to participate actually went, it would have probably been 10 times the amount. The second is a program that I helped coordinate during MLK Week. We had a documentary on Byron Rustin, who, if you don't know, is kind of an unsung champion during civil rights movement. There was 10 people there, and I found that to be so interesting, considering all of the interest in people wanting to be civically engaged, but them not actually taking that leap into doing it?
Mhm.
Or is that just an arcane question that can't really
No.
ever be answered?
No, I think that it's, there's so much there. Did everyone hear that? The question is about, especially thinking about the higher education context, the gap between young people who may want to be engaged in different actions versus the young people who actually show up. And sometimes when opportunities are offered and folks don't make it, how do we, is this about how do we get young people to be more interested in taking advantage of these opportunities and offering them? This goes back to, I think, the part of what I didn't get to talk about today, but we're in a moment where our conceptions of what it means to be civically engaged are influenced by neoliberalism, and neoliberalism is the idea that the rules of the market now structure our civic life. Like, citizenship is not considered a collective social democratic process as much anymore. It's considered much more individual and about how we choose to spend our dollars, for example. So a really great article about this is Joel Westheimer and Joe Kahn wrote an article about the 3 kinds of citizens, and they talk about how, for the most part, a lot of our character education, a lot of our civics education is based on the model of the individually responsible citizen. That you are a good citizen if you are nice to people, you work hard, you pay your taxes, you contribute to a food drive by giving a can of food. It's all individual actions that don't require social interaction as much, because our society has gotten to a point where what you go out and how you choose to spend your money is the way that you participate as a citizen, very individually oriented. The other 2 forms are about getting participatory citizens and then justice-oriented citizens, which it takes different kinds of education to do. So it's not surprising that in an environment in which individual responsibility is kind of the order of the day, that coming out to these different events might not seem like the best use of people's time. It doesn't seem like the way to be spending it. And also because our education system has prioritized individual outcomes of, like, I need to go to do the things that will get me into college, that will get me a job so that I can support my family. We have a society that's very much into individualism, which I think makes it harder. And also, because of some of the statistics earlier about feelings of disempowerment, disengagement, not being sure that whether I put the effort out, if it's going to actually do anything, it's going to mean anything. There's a hump that has to be overcome, and this is what all nonprofits that work with community organizing, they have to go through that hump of getting people to trust that if they show up, it's going to be worth their time. That takes a long time. So sometimes when these events pop up, folks are just like, it's not worth my time. So I think it takes a lot of effort to think about, and I think it would be helpful if different organizations on a campus could all coordinate together and to kind of create a pathway for young people to be involved that are in between those big moments, the big outrages that happen where we all show up. How do we keep something going before that and then through that and after that? It'd be really interesting to think about. Cool. So obviously come up, let's continue the conversation. Hope to see you online, get more pizza, and thank you.